For many Americans, fall may come as a welcome reprieve from a summer of record heat waves and multiple close calls as the power grid reached its brink. Customers across the country, especially in California, were asked at times to conserve their energy usage, turning down the lights, taking shorter showers, and turning down the AC even as temperatures spiked. You're listening to Energy Solutions, a podcast from the Electric Power Supply Association, where we showcase the voices, stories, and trends behind America's changing electric grid. I'm your host, Todd Snitchler, EPSA's president and CEO. Our guest this episode is Mark Christie, one of 5 commissioners on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which is the primary government regulator for the power grid and electricity markets. He's voiced strong concern about making sure the power system remains reliable through the energy transition. We had a long conversation about his priorities as a commissioner and how his many years as a state regulator in Virginia has informed how he makes his decisions that have critical impacts for the reliability, cost, and makeup of the nation's power grid. Thanks, Commissioner, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I know your schedule is very full and you have a lot on your plate, but I'm going to start out asking a little bit about what we think is the most critical issue facing FERC and the entire energy industry, frankly, which is reliability. And I know you've made a number of comments voicing your concern with power grid reliability at the August open meeting, as well as at the FERC summer meeting that you and I both attended. Can you talk a little bit about that for those that maybe didn't hear your comments and maybe share why you're concerned and what do you think are the primary causes for that concern that you have?
Well, Todd, just like you, I was a state regulator and I did it a little bit longer than you did. I did it 17 years, which is longer than most state regulators do it. But so I look at everything really from the consumer standpoint. As a state regulator, you're worried about retail rates because, we're the ones who have to set the retail rates, and that's what shows up in people's monthly bills.
That's right.
Consumers don't think in terms of wholesale markets or don't even know that FERC exists. Consumers think in terms of their monthly bills. And consumers want 2 things, and I think we ought to want 2 things. Reliable power at the least cost. And when I say the least cost, what I mean is obviously subject to law. Every state and of course federal law builds in aspects that keep it from being the absolute least cost that you could achieve power. Because from a consumer standpoint, that's what they care about. The consumer cares about give me reliable power and give it to me at a price that is the least cost that it takes to get it to me. And I don't use the term affordable. What's affordable for Bill Gates or Michael Bloomberg is not what's affordable to, waitress at the Cracker Barrel. So I don't think affordable is the term we ought to be using. We ought to be looking at what is the lowest price we can get it to the waitress at the Cracker Barrel or the large manufacturing consumer. Industrial consumers are incredibly important in our economy. They're, as you know, you come from Ohio, which is a Midwestern state. My wife comes from Michigan. These are industrial states. I mean, in the Midwest, from Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, states like this, Indiana, these are industrial states, and the cost of power is critically important to whether they can continue to provide jobs. So my focus is reliability at the least cost. And I'm very concerned about both. We are facing, I've said before, we're facing a reliability crisis. We are reaching a reliability crisis. And I think, the reason really comes down to this. Any engineer who's had to run a balancing or a system operator, balancing authority, will tell you that to keep the lights on a 24/7, 365 basis, and that's what people expect in America. We don't put up with, 12 hours of outages every day. I mean, there are places in this world that are glad to get 12 hours of power a day and the other 12 hours are off. We don't accept that in the United States.
That's right. Well,
to do that, you absolutely have to have what is called dispatchable generation. Dispatchable generation. This is generation that can run all the time. It's not weather dependent. And what's happening is, and the people in MISO have been warning us about this, specifically, because of a lot of reasons, we're shutting down dispatchable generation, coal in particular, but also gas, much too quickly before the system is really set up to continue to, to replace that dispatchable generation.
Mm-hmm.
And this is going on, and it's threatening reliability. MISO has been very explicit in warning about this. NERC, which is the electric reliability organization for the whole country,
Mm-hmm.
And they are truly experts. They have been warning about this, not just in MISO, but throughout the country, that we are shutting down dispatchable generation, oftentimes years before its useful life is even over. And we're shutting it down too quickly. And the push is to replace this with intermittent resources like wind and solar. Well, the problem is a megawatt of nameplate coal or gas is not equal to a megawatt of nameplate wind or solar. It's not a one-for-one trade. And so saying, well, we can shut down 5,000 megawatts of coal or gas, and as long as we get 5,000 megawatts of wind or solar nameplate, is just a false premise.
Mm-hmm.
And I was at a meeting yesterday with some people who run co-ops. They're expressing the same concern that increasingly, the system operator is running CT, which is combustion turbine gas, to make up for the lack of baseload.
Mm-hmm.
And CT, which are peakers, are not made to be baseload units.
Yep.
They're peakers. That's why they're called
peak
peakers.
shavers. That's right.
And so the problem when you're running, CT peakers to keep the lights on, because you don't have enough baseload, is twofold. First of all, ironically, these peakers tend to be much more heavy emissions,
Mm-hmm.
GHG emissions than say a combined cycle gas baseload unit. So the irony is you're increasing carbon emissions by running these CT peakers to keep the lights on.
Right.
They also tend to be very expensive. So, you're setting a price that is much, much too high compared to what you could have been getting. So yeah, I'm very concerned about reliability. And of course, I haven't even gotten into cost. Those are just reliability problems
Mm-hmm.
that we're looking at.
I'm curious how you think about the reliability question as we look at, the various studies that have been done. And I think they're universal in that if we're going to see greater electrification across the economy, whether it's the electric vehicle front or industry or buildings, what have you, there's going to be a fairly significant demand increase that's going to need to be met by additional supply. And that's going to perhaps look differently in what the supply stack includes. But we also hear from advocates quite a bit about the impacts of extreme weather. And I think we're seeing some of that on the system today with droughts in the West and this Winter Storm Uri outcome and some of the other issues that we're perhaps looking at in New England this winter. And should we be thinking differently about how we're planning for the grid looking forward if we're going to see that dramatic uptick in demand along with what is, call it the new normal of weather events that include things like the drought out West and the situations that we see in other parts of the country in different times of the year?
Well, let's just take what's going to happen with if the goals of a lot of groups, which is that, their slogan is electrify everything.
Yep.
So let's say that everything is electrified, the whole transportation fleet, cars, trucks,
Mm-hmm.
all home heating is switched to electrification. Then obviously you're going to see a tremendous increase in load.
That's right.
Which of course is the lingo in the business for simply for demand, for usage. All right, ISO New England put out a very interesting study about a month ago. And ISO New England said that as electrification increases load and as more renewables are injected into the fleet, ISO New England said that reserve margins may need to rise to 300% by 2040. Now let's unpack what that means. Now, reserve margin is what a utility has to contract for or build. They can put it in their rate base if they're allowed to by their state. That's another issue.
Yep.
So typically the reserve margin, I know in PJM has been 15%. Mm-hmm. So the load serving utility has to keep 15%. What that means is they have to have 15% more generating capacity available to them than what their load would justify. And it's obviously for reliability purposes. So ISO New England is saying that if we're going to electrify everything in New England, which is going to dramatically increase load, which is power being consumed. And we're going to go to meet some of the state renewable portfolio standards in New England, which are pushing for 100% renewable.
Mm-hmm.
If both of those things happen by 2040, we're going to have to tell load serving utilities, you need a reserve margin of 300%, not 15. And, that is going to be extraordinarily costly.
Yeah, that brings us back to your
let's just be
concern
honest about it.
low cost.
Think about, I don't even know, the arithmetic on that is, like 15 to 30 is okay, you're doubling the reserve margin. Okay, 15 to 45, you're tripling the reserve margin. This is 15 to 300%. That's by a factor about, by my arithmetic, about what, 20? But what we know is that is going to be hugely expensive because these load serving utilities have to buy that. They have to buy that capacity.
Mm-hmm.
And so, point being that the huge, the push on electrification of everything, electrify everything, is going to be tremendously increase load. Okay, that's a given.
Yep.
And if we're already at current load facing reliability gaps, and we're getting warnings that the RTOs and ISOs are going to have trouble even meeting current load given the existing resources. Well, then imagine if we double load or triple load.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you don't need to be a rocket scientist or electrical engineer to see that is not going to be, it represents tremendous threats to not only reliability, but also cost.
Yeah. I don't know if you've heard Jim Robb, who you've mentioned, who is the NERC, the reliability coordinator.
Well, I've heard him a lot, and I've praised him a lot because I give Jim Robb credit for the courage to speak out and say things that I'm sure there's a lot of interest groups that don't want to hear.
And he has been saying now, I think more regularly, that he is less enamored with the concept of reserve margin and more interested in planning around available energy, and to use your term, more dispatchable energy in order to make sure that they can ensure reliability. I don't know if you've given that a lot of thought. That seems to be maybe where the discussion needs to head.
Oh, I think the whole landscape needs to be on the table, and I'm mixing metaphors here, just
Sure.
ridiculously. But I think, first of all, let's understand in the United States of America, we have a federal system. We still do. A lot of people would like to have everything micromanaged from Washington, but we have a federal system with 50 different states, and reliability and resource adequacy. I've said this repeatedly, and I'm going to continue to say it. And I know people say, well, you're a former state regulator. Of course, you're saying that. Look, reliability and resource adequacy ultimately is going to be the responsibility of state regulators and the policymakers that pass the laws that they have to implement. Now, in non-RTO states, that's clearly the case. I mean, in non-RTO states, most of which are still vertically integrated, most of which are still proceeding on what we call an IRP, integrated resource plan approach, meaning they have vertically integrated utilities, and those utilities, to a significant degree, own their own generation. They rate base it, or they either contract on a bilateral basis to get it, and their state regulators are watching them very closely and to see what they're doing. Interestingly enough, you're not hearing about the problems in non-RTO states that you're hearing about in the RTO states with reliability. Because in the RTO states, the push has been for the last 20 years, to achieve reliability through RTO markets, whether it's energy markets, day ahead markets, ancillary markets, or of course, capacity markets, and they all vary. And PJM has a capacity market, ISO New England, ISO New York have capacity markets. MISO's is residual. SPP does not have one. CAISO does not have one. So it isn't like everybody has one. And of course, one of the most famous of the last year is Texas, which is an energy-only market. They don't have any form of capacity market. So when we look at Jim Robb's concern and we look at ISO New England saying we're going to have 300% reserve margin, a lot of the problems that we're seeing, and the problems with MISO's capacity auction this spring, which by all accounts was a very bad result in terms of reliability. All these problems are coming up in RTO markets. They're not coming up in non-RTO, vertically integrated, state-regulated states. I think that's not coincidental. I don't think it's coincidental.
Let me gently push back on that and say that some of the states that you mentioned are not perhaps states that are putting in place policies by state policymakers that are more aggressive in terms of emissions reductions and trying to turn over the fleet faster than perhaps some of the states in restructured markets that are trying to take that more aggressive approach. And that really leads me to one of my other questions. So if you'll indulge me, I'll just skip ahead to that and talk about the tension between state regulators and federal regulators and state policies versus federal policy, and kind of how we try to resolve and address some of the tension that clearly exists.
Well, first of all, one thing I learned in 17 years as a state regulator is, I was a regulator in Virginia. And one thing I learned going to all the NARUC meetings and state regional meetings like OPSI, the PJM states, yep. MACRUC, which is, we have a lot of acronym groups in state regulation, but they're all meetings of state regulators and from the national down to regional. And I went to a lot of those and participated, and I was on the OPSI board and MACRUC and spent a lot of time at NARUC. One thing I learned, and really the best benefit I obtained from all those meetings with other state regulators is what I learned is I know more about Virginia than you do in your state. Yes. But I don't know anything like what you know about your state. And when I came to FERC, I didn't all of a sudden become omniscient and all of a sudden know more about Indiana, Minnesota, Michigan, Utah, North Carolina than their regulators. And so I am very, very reluctant to pretend that I or anybody else on this commission knows more than those state regulators about what they need and what's going on in their states. And the fact is we do not. And so I approach the state-federal tension by starting off by saying, as a federal regulator, I don't know as much as the state regulators know in their home states. Mm-hmm. So number one, there ought to be a thinking that as long as you're not violating the Federal Power Act, and I realize we do have to enforce the Federal Power Act, of course, Congress passed it, and of course we have to enforce it. That's our job. Yep. But there's a lot of play in the joints there in terms of, a very term like just and reasonable rates. There's a lot of, that is a fairly nebulous term. I don't think it's that nebulous. I think what you're trying to do with just and reasonable rates is make sure the consumer doesn't pay any more than the consumer should pay. And that gets back to my least cost, which is a long-winded way of saying, in America, reliability and resource and the resource adequacy, and that's sort of a term of art, but it really comes down to, once again, like, do you have enough power when you need it? Yep. The states are still the primary responsible parties for that. Now, again, that's explicitly in the non-RTO states. No one has any question about that. Now, you mentioned, well, what about if they're in an RTO and they've turned over their reliability to the capacity market? What I would say on that, and I came out of PJM, so I'm well aware of the construct you're talking about, is whatever your state legislature, and if your state legislature went the full Monty on deregulation, which means you force your load serving utilities to divest their generation. That's the full Monty. Correct. Even then, your state retains the police power to adopt a different model. And so you just can't take the attitude, well, we'll leave it up to PJM to figure it out, or leave it up to, MISO to figure it. Because MISO is a residual capacity market. Right. And I know it's not easy. A state regulator once told me from another state, we were having this conversation. And I said, why don't you go back to cost of service, or why don't you go back and tell your utilities start building generation again if you're worried about it? He was complaining about a certain capacity market in a certain RTO. And he says, well, we can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. Well, I understand the difficulty of it. It's not easy, but it's not outside of your legal authority to tell your load serving utilities, if you think you're going to be short on capacity, tell them start building capacity again, put it in rate base, do it through bilateral contracts. There are a lot of options out there that your police power as a state still gives you the authority to do.
It's clear that it seems to me that the commission seems to be contemplating more environmental considerations in its decision making. And of course, those issues seem to be of utmost importance to a number of advocates, but there's certainly room for disagreement. And I think it's clear that there is some about where FERC's actual mandate to deal with environmental questions to deliver affordable and reliable power lands. I'm curious if you've got a kind of a bright line position on where you think that line needs to be drawn, and does the line move, or has it moved based on the political makeup of the commission? Or,
well, I look at it this way: the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, which used to be the Federal Power Commission, has two primary duties under federal law. One is under the Federal Power Act, which has been in effect for decades. It's been amended, of course, but under the Federal Power Act, we are first and foremost a rate regulator. That's an economic regulatory function. Our job under the Federal Power Act is first and foremost to ensure that consumers in wholesale markets are not getting charged above just and reasonable rates. We're a rate regulator. It is I look at it as a consumer protection statute. That statute has not been amended by Congress to say that FERC shall also be a second EPA. Congress could do that, but they haven't done it. So we remain first and foremost under the Federal Power Act a rate regulator, an economic regulator. And so when we regulate, particularly applicable to the RTO markets, let's say, or ISO markets, the standard always usually comes down in all these cases to does this tariff change, or does this proposal result in just and reasonable rates,
right?
And not unduly discriminatory. Let me add that, because it's not just and reasonable, it's just and reasonable and not unduly discriminatory, which means that we cannot discriminate among types of generation. All right, we should not be and cannot legally favor wind or solar to meet some environmental goals, or attempt to hamper, coal and gas. And conversely, there was a big controversy 4 years ago about whether, there was an effort, it was called the quote unquote coal bailout, but a lot of what was, whether that was accurate or not. The point being, FERC voted it down, I think on a 5-0 vote, I think back in 2017. And I remember Rob Powelson saying, who was from Pennsylvania, that, we're not here to favor one resource over another. And he didn't come to FERC to blow up the markets. But by the same token, okay, we shouldn't be promoting or subsidizing, indirectly or directly, wind or solar or other forms of generation either. We have to be neutral. And Federal Power Act says be neutral. So I think clearly the Federal Power Act gives us the primary duty of being an economic regulator, and an economic regulator to make sure that consumers are not being charged more than just and reasonable rates. And we cannot be unduly discriminatory, meaning we can't pick and choose and say we want to promote these resources because this fits the new, goal of the Biden administration for whatever, that's GHG is an environmental policy, and that's for Congress to decide. If Congress wants to pass a mandatory national RPS, they can do that. They haven't done it. Now, Natural Gas Act is the other primary duty we have. We're the permitting agency for interstate gas pipelines and related facilities like compressor stations, for example. And here again, the Natural Gas Act is very clear about what our duties are under the Natural Gas Act. We're to make an economic determination whether a pipeline is needed, and if it is, we're supposed to approve it. We're also under NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, but we're under NEPA in the sense that every federal agency is under NEPA. So any facility that we permit, before we do it, we have to do a NEPA analysis. So clearly we have environmental duties under NEPA, and we have to do that. But the question is how far those go, and we've had a lot of debate over here and controversy, actually going back 4 years, really,
Yeah.
To how far do FERC's duties go under NEPA. When the majority on this commission tried to put out a certificate policy, certificate being the CPCN, Certificate of Public Need, for these interstate pipelines, I filed a dissent, and because in my dissent, I said what the majority was doing was they were basically going, they were going way beyond the authority the Natural Gas Act gave us, and they were trying to turn FERC essentially into another EPA, and try to set up a regime where we could just simply reject a pipeline because of an estimate of greenhouse gas emissions, not just from the pipe itself, but globally.
Mm-hmm.
I said that's nowhere near that is nowhere found in the Natural Gas Act, nowhere in the Natural Gas Act, and several senators, including Senator Manchin, agreed with us. And make a long story short, the majority pulled that certificate back and made it a draft. And as it sits right now, it's just a draft. But I think if I was going to explain to the Rotary Club what FERC does, and I have explained to the Rotary Club, the Lions Club, we do two things primarily. We regulate wholesale electricity sales under the Federal Power Act as an economic regulator, and our main duty there is make sure that consumers are not being charged more than just and reasonable rates. And under the Natural Gas Act, we permit pipelines. Mm-hmm. And of course, we have a reliability requirement under the Federal Power Act. I think it's Section 213 that told us to set up NERC. What we don't have is an authority to tell states what to build or shut down, and we're not the national IRP planner.
Well, I think that's helpful for those that maybe aren't as familiar. And since you mentioned transmission, I did have a question I wanted to ask you around transmission, because clearly it's occupying a lot of time at FERC right now. And I'm curious about how you think about the reforms that transmission siting contemplates. I'm curious if there's a way, or if you see kind of a rational middle approach as opposed to the two extremes. The NIMBY problem seems to have evolved into a banana, which is build absolutely nothing anytime, anywhere. And that's not going to be really effective as we look at how things are going to go if the economy does electrify and the increase in demand, as we've been talking about. How do you think FERC should try to keep the extremes at bay and think about this more from a minimize politics and be thoughtful and have a rational, reality-based approach to where we are to where we may end up going?
I'll just tell you from experience as a state regulator who sat on literally scores of certificate proceedings for power lines, that every one of them is going to be controversial because people simply don't want to look at a power line. Sure. I will say this. My commission in Virginia, we approved both the trail line and we approved the Dominion James River crossing. So I think the premise that state commissions, can't be trusted to approve these needed power lines, and that's why we have to have federal backstop. I reject that totally. Okay. And I would use trail and the Jamestown crossing as two examples where a state commission, my commission, stood up and approved those lines despite the tremendous controversy. And I sat in high school gyms and heard hundreds of people yelling about, on both of those, their opposition. And we went ahead and approved them because we had to, and because the evidence was just incontrovertible that these lines were needed. So my view on federal backstop siting authorities, I'm not in favor of it. But Congress passed it last year in the one of the bills they passed. And if it ever comes to us on an individual case, then of course I'll deal with that as an individual case, and whatever my personal feelings are, I'm not going to prejudge that case. Sure,
of course. It sounds like there's a lesson for state regulators as well, which I think is a good one, which is sometimes it takes some intestinal fortitude to do the right thing in the face of opposition, if that's the right thing. So that's a lesson that probably applies across the board, I think, whether you're a state or a federal regulator.
No, I agree. And I spent 17 years as a state regulator, and I never went into a case thinking, gee, if I vote a certain way, I'll never get reelected. Right. But we follow the law. So my view is always follow the law, take the heat, do the right thing. And then you can sleep good at night. And, if you don't get reelected, okay, you don't get reelected. But I did twice.
In your view, what's the biggest challenge that you see facing the American power grid today?
Reliability at rates that and you have to use affordability here, I guess, but reliability at a cost that I would say typical consumers can afford. Let's say typical consumers. And it's not just the threat facing the U.S. It's facing Europe. I mean, Europe's having a horrendous situation in their skyrocketing energy prices. Europe, and I have to include the UK now that after Brexit, you got to say UK separately. But
Correct.
Europe and the UK are having a terrible situation. But they're where we're going. Okay, they're just getting there first. Now, people say, "Oh, that's just because Putin invaded Ukraine, and if it wasn't for that, they wouldn't." What the invasion of Ukraine simply brought to a head or accelerated issues that were going to be issues in Europe anyway. Because Europe has followed a policy for the last 10 years of refusing to develop its own gas supply. And they've been depending on Putin, through Nord Stream. Mm-hmm. And so all of a sudden he cut them off. But the fundamental problem in Europe is they have been refusing to build the baseload generation, just like we are, that could keep their lights on. And they've been introducing, tremendous amounts of wind and solar, and which are obviously intermittent. And they've been shutting down baseload. Germany, after Fukushima, the German government under Angela Merkel, essentially panicked and agreed to shut down all their nukes. And now they wish they had those nukes. I mean, they're begging. I think there's 3 remaining nukes in Germany that they're trying to keep open because of the crisis. And I think they're not even going to be able to do that necessarily, at least more than a few months, because they're already so advanced in decommissioning. And, I see Governor Newsom in California is desperately trying to keep Diablo Canyon open. And, he crusaded against that for years before he became governor. So, we're having coming face to face with reality here. We need baseload generation, whether it's nuclear, whether it's coal, whether it's gas. We have to have baseload generation. We have to have dispatchable generation. You cannot run a system strictly on intermittent. There's a role for intermittent. This is not anti-wind, anti-solar at all. Any resource that is emission-free and has, literally no fuel cost is a good resource to have. So this is not anti-wind, anti-solar. It's just a position that we have to deal with reality, and you have to have a mix in your system of dispatchable resources as well as intermittent like wind and solar. You have to have that mix. You cannot go all the way to just purely intermittent, and you can't plug the hole with DR or some of the other, and you can't plug it with storage. Storage is a great potential resource for the future, but it is not even close to being near commercial scale or industrial scale to keep the lights on in San Francisco or LA overnight. It's not there yet.
So it feels like we're at a bit of an inflection point. And so I'll ask you my last question, which is there anything in our space in the energy and utility world that makes you optimistic?
Well, ultimately, the solution, of course, is going to be technology. Mm-hmm. There are some very promising technologies. I mean, battery storage is promising. It's promising. It's not there yet as a major ability to switch the system to wind and solar and have battery capacity that's going to keep the lights on when they're not, when the sun's not shining, wind's not blowing. Mm-hmm. But it's going to take years, to get that potential realized at a price that's affordable. I think one of the most promising technologies is small modular reactors, SMRs. I mean, look at the advantage of small modular reactors. Mm-hmm. First of all, nuclear is emission free. So right off the bat, you have no carbon emissions from SMRs. They're base load. They run with a capacity factor of north of 90%. Mm-hmm. That alone tells you this is a tremendously valuable resource if we can, if we can develop this technology to the point where it can generate electricity at something in the neighborhood of $60, $70 a megawatt hour, something that puts it in the market as far as what other resources can do. But it ain't there yet. It's promising, but it's not there yet for full commercial scale rollout. I hope it gets there. My optimism is purely because, technological advancements that we don't even think are possible, in fact, are. I mean, look at the COVID vaccine. You know, when COVID hit, we were being told by all the experts that, you know, it would be 5 or 7 or 8 years before we could get a COVID vaccine. You know, that maybe even 10 years. You know, that's how long it takes. And we got a COVID vaccine in about 10 months. It's hard to decide. You know, the hard thing about government sponsored research is are you putting money into the right. You know, technologies, or you putting it in some pipe dream, no pun intended. But I am optimistic that you know, the potential to develop technology that's going to give us emissions-free baseload generation is possible. Now, whether, you know, how quickly it comes, that's the thing. We can't suffer through skyrocketing prices and reliability crises, you know, in the years it's going to take to develop these technologies. We have, and this is the whole point about this so-called energy transition. A transition means, you know, a continuum in time. It doesn't mean that tomorrow, and it means a period of time during which you transition. And during that, we have got to have a power system that is reliable and that again, the waitress at Cracker Barrel can afford.
Well, we certainly share your optimism around innovation. We think that is where the future will lie as well. So on that note of agreement, I will thank you very much for your time today, and certainly appreciate you taking the opportunity to share your thoughts with our listeners and with folks from EPSA about reliability and how we're going to make sure that we keep the consumer front and center as we address, you know, the changing energy mix as well as the reliability of the system today. So thank you, Commissioner Christie, for joining us.
All right, Todd, enjoyed it very much.
Thank you. As we head into winter, and as policymakers continue to push for more zero-emission resources and a further electrified economy, the challenges facing our power system are only likely to continue. Stay tuned for more conversations on how we can address these issues and the role competitive power suppliers and electricity markets will play in bringing solutions to the table. You can learn more about the FERC proceedings impacting the competitive power sector and how EPSA has weighed in at epsa.org. And for all things FERC, head to www.ferc.gov. Thanks for listening to Energy Solutions. If you like this episode, please share it on social media or with your coworkers, friends, and family. You can also connect with us on Twitter at EPSA News and on LinkedIn. And subscribe, follow, leave a rating, or comment on Spotify, Pandora, Google, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Energy Solutions is brought to you by the Electric Power Supply Association. EPSA represents America's competitive power suppliers, which bring about 150,000 megawatts of power generation resources to customers throughout the United States. Discover the power of competition at www.epsa.org.